The first mortar round exploded 20 yards to my left, showering me with volcanic sand that felt like broken glass against my face. I pressed myself deeper into the black beach, my M1 Garand clutched against my chest, as another shell screamed overhead and detonated somewhere behind me in the surf. The sound was like the world tearing apart. My name is Corporal James Bradley, and I was a Navy hospital corpsman attached to Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division. What I'm about to tell you happened on a godforsaken piece of volcanic rock called Iwo Jima, Sulphur Island to the Japanese, 8 square miles of hell that would cost more American lives per square yard than any battle in Marine Corps history. The morning of February 19th started quietly enough. Too quietly. We'd been aboard the transport ships for what felt like weeks, cramped into the holds with hundreds of other Marines, all of us knowing what was coming. The Navy had been pounding Iwo Jima for 72 straight days with the most intensive pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War. Admiral Blandy had promised us that nothing could survive that kind of punishment. Gentlemen, he'd told us, this will be a walkover. He was wrong. At 0645 hours, I climbed down the cargo net into Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel 1436, my medical bag slung across my shoulder and my .45 caliber pistol on my hip. Hospital corpsmen weren't supposed to carry rifles, Geneva Convention, and all that, but I'd learned on Bougainville that the Japanese didn't much care about red crosses painted on helmets. The landing craft bucked and rolled in the 6-foot swells as we formed up with the rest of the assault waves. Around me, Marines checked their equipment one last time. Sergeant Michael Strank, our squad leader, was methodically cleaning his M1. He was 24, from Pennsylvania, and one of the steadiest men I'd ever known. Next to him sat Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona who never said much but had eyes that seemed to see everything. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, just 18 years old, was trying to joke around to calm his nerves, but his voice had a tremor in it. "Hey Doc," called out Private First Class Rene Gagnon, a mill worker's son from New Hampshire, "you got anything for seasickness in that bag of yours?" "Save your stomach troubles for the beach, Gagnon," I replied, trying to keep my own voice steady. "You're going to need all the help you can get once we hit the sand." As our landing craft approached the beach, I could see Mount Suribachi looming over us like a malevolent sentinel. The 556-foot extinct volcano dominated the southern tip of the island, its slopes honeycombed with gun positions that had somehow survived the 72 days of bombardment. Intelligence had told us the Japanese garrison numbered around 13,000 men under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. What they hadn't told us was that Kuribayashi was one of the most brilliant defensive tacticians in the Imperial Army, and that he'd spent months turning Iwo Jima into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. The beach we were heading for, designated Green Beach, looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light. No explosions, no gunfire, just black volcanic sand rising up to low ridges covered in scrub brush. That should have been our first warning. At 0900 hours, the ramp of our landing craft dropped, and we charged into 3 feet of surf. The volcanic sand was loose and deep, like trying to run through coal dust. Every step sank 6 inches, and the weight of our equipment made it feel like we were moving through molasses. I helped drag wounded men out of subsequent landing craft, Marines who'd been hit by sniper fire from positions we couldn't even see. For the first hour, the Japanese held their fire. They let us pile up on the beach, let more and more landing craft deposit their human cargo on that narrow strip of black sand. When we were packed together like sardines, when there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, that's when Kuribayashi sprung his trap. The first artillery barrage came at 10:30 hours. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced, and I'd been through Bougainville and Guam. The shells seemed to come from everywhere at once, from Mount Suribachi, from the ridges ahead of us, from positions dug so deep into the volcanic rock that our pre-invasion bombardment hadn't even scratched them. The Japanese had registered every yard of that beach, and their artillery was devastating in its precision. I saw men simply disappear. One moment they were there, running toward the first ridge, and the next there was just a crater and pieces of equipment scattered in the sand. The noise was indescribable, not just the explosions, but the screaming of the shells, the shouting of officers trying to rally their men, the cries of the wounded. "Corpsman! Corpsman!" The calls seemed to come from everywhere at once. I ran toward the first voice I heard, sliding down into a shell crater where a Marine from Fox Company lay with his left leg nearly severed at the knee. Shrapnel from a mortar round, probably a Type 97 81mm. I applied a tourniquet and gave him morphine from my medical bag, but there was nothing I could do about the shock in his eyes, that look that said he couldn't believe this was happening to him. "You're going to be fine, son," I told him, lying through my teeth as I bandaged the stump of his leg. "Just stay down and keep pressure on this bandage." I left him there and crawled toward the next call for help, keeping as low as possible. The Japanese had excellent fields of fire from their positions in the ridges, and they were picking off anyone who showed themselves above ground level. These weren't the desperate bonsai charges we'd faced on other islands. This was methodical, disciplined defensive warfare, and it was killing us. By noon on D-Day, we'd advanced barely 200 yards from the beach. The cost had been enormous. The 28th Marines alone had taken over 400 casualties in the first 6 hours. Colonel Harry Liversedge, our regimental commander, was reorganizing what was left of his units for an assault on the ridges that blocked our path to Mount Suribachi. "Bradley," Sergeant Strang called me over to a shallow depression where Easy Company was gathering. "We're going to take that first ridge. You stay close, but not too close. These boys are going to need you." I nodded, checking my medical supplies, morphine, bandages, sulfa powder, battle dressings. Never enough, never enough. In my pack I carried extra ammunition for the riflemen, because sometimes keeping them in the fight was the best way to protect the wounded. The assault on the first ridge began at 1400 hours. Easy Company moved out in small teams, using whatever cover the volcanic terrain provided. The Japanese positions were invisible until they opened fire, machine gun nests dug deep into the rock, connected by tunnels that allowed the defenders to pop up anywhere along the ridge line. Private Sousley was the first man in our squad to get hit. He was running between two shell craters when a burst from a Nambu machine gun caught him in the chest. He went down hard, and I crawled over to him under covering fire from Sergeant Strang's M1. "Doc, I can't breathe," Sousley gasped. Pink froth was coming from his mouth, lungs shot. I rolled him onto his side and tried to seal the chest wounds, but there were too many of them. I gave him morphine and held his hand while he died, this 18-year-old kid from Kentucky who'd been joking around in the landing craft just a few hours earlier. That was the reality of Iwo Jima. Good men dying for yards of worthless volcanic rock, because that worthless rock was the only stepping stone to Japan, and we had to have it. The fighting for that first ridge took 3 days. 3 days of crawling forward a few yards at a time, of calling in naval gunfire and airstrikes on positions we could barely locate, of watching Marines die in ones and twos for every foot of ground we gained. The Japanese didn't give ground. They had to be killed in their positions, one by one, with grenades and flamethrowers and bayonets. On February 22nd, we finally took the ridge. Easy Company was down to about half strength, but we'd broken through the first line of Japanese defenses. More importantly, we'd reached the base of Mount Suribachi, and Colonel Liversedge was planning an assault on the volcano itself. "Tomorrow we take that mountain," he told us that evening as we huddled in our foxholes. "The Japs have been shooting down at us from up there for 4 days. Time to return the favor." February 23rd dawned gray and windy, with low clouds hanging over the island. The assault on Mount Suribachi began at 0800 hours, with a 40-man patrol from Easy Company under Lieutenant Harold Schreier. I went with them, along with Sergeant Strang, Corporal Harlan Block, and the others who would later be in that famous photograph. The climb up Mount Suribachi was terrifying. The slopes were steep and loose, covered with volcanic ash that slid away under our boots. Every cave, every crevice could hide a Japanese sniper or machine gun position. We expected to be cut to pieces before we reached the top. But the mountain was strangely quiet. The Japanese had withdrawn most of their forces from the summit during the night, falling back to their main defensive positions in the center and north of the island. By 10:20 hours, we'd reached the rim of the crater at the top of Mount Suribachi. Lieutenant Schreier had brought along a small American flag, 54 inches by 28 inches, and we raised it on a piece of Japanese pipe we found in the rubble. It wasn't much of a ceremony, just a few Marines on a windy mountaintop, but when that flag went up, every ship in the invasion fleet began blowing their horns and whistles. Even the Marines fighting in the ridges below us stopped what they were doing to cheer. A few hours later, a larger flag was brought up from one of the landing ships, 96 inches by 56 inches, big enough to be seen from anywhere on the island. When we raised that second flag, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal happened to be in position to capture the moment. None of us knew we were making history. We were just Marines doing our job. Of the 6 men who raised that flag, Sergeant Strank, Corporals Block and Hayes, Privates Gagnon and Sousley, and Navy Hospital Corpsman John Bradley, 3 would be dead within a week. Strank was killed by artillery fire on March 1st. Block died from mortar fire on March 1st as well. Sousley was shot by a sniper on March 21st, just days before the island was declared secure. But taking Mount Suribachi was just the beginning. The mountain was only the southern tip of Iwo Jima. The real battle lay ahead of us in the center and north of the island, where General Kuribayashi had constructed a defense in depth unlike anything we'd encountered in the Pacific War. The Japanese had turned the northern 2/3 of Iwo Jima into a fortress. They'd dug more than 1,500 rooms connected by 16 miles of tunnels, all hewn from the solid volcanic rock. They had underground hospitals, ammunition storage areas, command posts, and barracks. Many of the positions had multiple entrances and exits, so that Japanese troops could disappear into one tunnel and pop up hundreds of yards away. Every ridge, every ravine, every possible approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire from machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces. The Japanese had 361 artillery pieces of 75 mm or larger, 300 anti-aircraft guns that could be depressed for ground targets, 20,000 light machine guns and rifles, and enough ammunition to sustain a long defensive battle. Most importantly, General Kuribayashi had abandoned the traditional Japanese tactics of banzai charges and death before dishonor attacks. His orders were simple: kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier, and make the Americans pay such a high price for Iwo Jima that they would think twice about invading Japan itself. On February 24th, the day after we took Mount Suribachi, the 5th Marine Division began its advance northward across the island. Our objective was Airfield No. 2, about 1,000 yards north of the volcano. It might as well have been 1,000 miles. The terrain was a nightmare. The volcanic rock had been twisted and broken by centuries of seismic activity into a maze of ridges, ravines, and rocky outcroppings. There was no soil, just sharp volcanic stone that cut through clothing and equipment. Every step forward was visible to Japanese observers, and every position had to be taken by direct assault. Easy Company was assigned to capture a ridge line that intelligence had designated Hill 362A. It was just a number on a map to the planners, but to us it was 200 yards of hell that cost the company 32 casualties in one afternoon. The Japanese positions were invisible until they opened fire. A squad of Marines would advance across what looked like open ground, only to discover that the ground was honeycombed with spider holes and camouflaged bunkers. The enemy would let our lead elements pass, then open fire from behind, cutting off any possibility of retreat. I spent that afternoon crawling from one wounded Marine to another, dragging them back to whatever cover I could find. The Japanese had sighted their mortars on all the natural cover, the shell craters and rocky outcroppings where wounded men would naturally seek shelter. It was a deliberate tactic to kill corpsmen and stretcher bearers, to break down the medical evacuation system that kept Marines fighting. Private First Class Tony Stein from Fox Company was working his way up the ridge with a Stinger, a makeshift machine gun he'd built from the wing gun of a crashed Navy fighter plane. He'd spot a Japanese position, charge forward firing from the hip, then fall back to reload. He made 8 separate attacks that day, each time exposing himself to concentrated enemy fire to knock out machine gun nests and spider holes. "That crazy is going to get himself killed," Sergeant Strank observed, but there was admiration in his voice. Stein's individual attacks were creating gaps in the Japanese defenses that the rest of us could exploit. By nightfall on February 24th, we'd advanced about 300 yards from the base of Mount Suribachi. It had cost the 28th Marines over 200 casualties, but we'd established a toehold in the Japanese defensive system. The real test would come the next day, when we had to expand that toehold into a breakthrough. February 25th brought rain and low visibility, weather that favored the defenders. The Japanese could hear us coming long before we could see their positions, and they used the limited visibility to launch small counterattacks designed to disrupt our advance. I was treating a wounded Marine in a shell crater when I heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. "Incoming," someone yelled, and I threw myself on top of my patient as the shells exploded around us. When the barrage lifted, I found that shrapnel had torn through my medical bag, destroying half my supplies. That was the constant problem on Iwo Jima, running out of everything. Ammunition, medical supplies, water, food. The logistics of keeping 70,000 Marines supplied on a tiny island under constant fire was a nightmare. Every supply run to the beach was a life or death gamble, because the Japanese still had artillery positions that could reach the landing areas. We were also running out of Marines. Easy Company started the battle with 310 men. By February 25th, we were down to fewer than 200 effectives. The replacements coming up from the beach were mostly green kids who'd never seen combat, and they were being thrown into the most intense fighting any of us had ever experienced. On February 26th, we finally took Airfield No. 2. The cost was enormous. The entire 5th Marine Division had taken over 1,500 casualties in just 7 days of fighting. But holding the airfield was crucial to our mission. Damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan would need that runway to make emergency landings. The first B-29 to land on Iwo Jima was a super fortress called Dynamite on March 4th. She'd been shot up over Tokyo and was barely airworthy, but her crew of 11 men made it down safely on our runway. As I watched those airmen climb out of their damaged bomber, I thought about all the Marines who died to capture those 1,500 yards of runway. Maybe it was worth it, maybe. By early March, the battle had settled into a grim pattern. Every day we would advance a few hundred yards. Every night the Japanese would counterattack to try to take back what they'd lost. The casualties were constant and horrific, not just from enemy fire, but from combat fatigue, from the stress of living in holes in the ground while people tried to kill you 24 hours a day. I saw Marines break down completely, men who'd been steady under fire suddenly unable to function. The 1,000-yard stare, we called it, that look in a man's eyes when he'd seen too much, when his mind just couldn't process any more horror. Some of them recovered after a few days of rest. Others had to be evacuated, their war over not because of physical wounds, but because their spirits had been broken. The Japanese were suffering too, but in a different way. They were fighting and dying for their emperor, for their homeland, for everything they believed in. They couldn't retreat, couldn't surrender, couldn't do anything but fight to the death in their underground fortresses. By early March, they were running short of food and water, but they kept fighting with a determination that was both admirable and terrifying. On March 8, Easy Company participated in an attack on a ridge system that intelligence had designated Hill 382. It was the strongest point in the Japanese defensive system, a maze of interconnected bunkers and tunnels that dominated the center of the island. Taking Hill 382 would break the backbone of Japanese resistance, but the price would be enormous. The attack began at 0730 hours with a 30-minute artillery barrage from every gun on the island, plus naval gunfire from the fleet offshore. The explosions were so intense that the ground shook continuously, like a prolonged earthquake. When the barrage lifted, we expected to find nothing but rubble and dead Japanese soldiers. We were wrong. The Japanese positions were so deep and so well constructed that the bombardment had barely scratched them. When Easy Company moved forward, we walked into a wall of machine gun and mortar fire that stopped us cold within 100 yards of the Japanese positions. Corporal Harlan Block was killed in the first 5 minutes, cut down by machine gun fire as he tried to knock out a camouflaged bunker. He'd been one of the 6 flag raisers on Mount Suribachi, a tough kid from Texas who'd survived every battle since Bougainville. Seeing him fall was like a punch to the gut for every Marine in the company. I crawled forward under fire to reach Block's body, hoping against hope that he was still alive. He wasn't. The machine gun burst had caught him in the chest, and he'd died instantly. I closed his eyes and took his dog tags, then crawled back to report his death to Sergeant Strank. Strank said quietly when I told him, "Harlan was a good Marine." That was all the eulogy Block got, 3 words from his squad leader in the middle of a battle. On Iwo Jima, there wasn't time for anything else. The attack on Hill 382 took 6 days and cost the 5th Marine Division over 800 casualties. When we finally took the position, we found that the Japanese had withdrawn most of their forces during the night, falling back to even stronger positions farther north. It was the pattern of the entire battle: pay an enormous price in blood for every yard of ground, only to discover that the enemy had simply fallen back to fight again. On March 16th, we got word that the island was almost ours. General Kuribayashi's remaining forces had been pushed back into a small pocket in the northern tip of Iwo Jima, and resistance was expected to end within days. Easy Company was assigned to mop up the remaining Japanese positions in the area around Kitano Point. It should have been easy duty after what we'd been through. It wasn't. The Japanese had saved some of their best troops for the final defense, and they fought with desperate courage in their last stronghold. Every cave, every bunker, every spider hole had to be cleared with grenades and flamethrowers. On March 21st, just 3 days before the island was declared secure, Private Franklin Sousley was killed by a sniper's bullet. He'd been one of the 6 flag raisers, the 18-year-old kid from Kentucky who'd tried to joke his way through the landing craft right on D-Day. He was helping to evacuate wounded Marines when a Japanese sniper put a bullet through his head. Sousley's death hit me particularly hard, maybe because he'd been so young, maybe because we'd come so far together since that first day on the beach. I'd seen hundreds of Marines die on Iwo Jima, but his death somehow seemed to sum up the senseless waste of the entire battle. He'd survived 36 days of the most intense combat in Marine Corps history, only to be killed when the end was in sight. On March 26, 1945, Iwo Jima was declared secure. The flag that had been raised on Mount Suribachi 36 days earlier still flew over the island, but the cost of keeping it there had been staggering. The American casualties were enormous: 6,821 dead and 19,217 wounded out of the 70,000 Marines and soldiers who'd landed on the island. The 5th Marine Division alone had taken over 7,000 casualties, more than twice the number of men who'd started the battle. Some companies had been wiped out completely and rebuilt 2 or 3 times with replacements. The Japanese losses were even worse, an estimated 18,844 dead out of the 22,000-man garrison. Only 216 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner, most of them wounded and unconscious when captured. General Kuribayashi himself was never found, though he's believed to have died in the final Banzai attack on March 25th. But numbers don't tell the whole story of what happened on Iwo Jima. The real story is in the small moments: Marines sharing their last cigarette with a wounded buddy, corpsmen crawling forward under fire to treat men they couldn't save, officers leading from the front, because that's what their men expected. I think about the Marines I knew who didn't make it off that island. Harlan Block, the tough kid from Texas who raised the flag and died fighting for a nameless ridge. Franklin Sousley, 18 years old with his whole life ahead of him, killed by a sniper 3 days before the battle ended. Mike Strank, the steady sergeant who held Easy Company together through 36 days of hell. They died for 8 square miles of volcanic rock that most Americans couldn't find on a map. But they also died for something larger than that, for the idea that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for. They died so that B-29 bombers would have a place to land when they were shot up over Japan. They died to bring the war one step closer to ending. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi became one of the most famous photographs in American history, a symbol of courage and sacrifice that inspired a nation. But for those of us who were there, the real meaning of Iwo Jima wasn't in that moment of triumph. It was in the quiet heroism of ordinary men doing extraordinary things under the worst possible conditions. 3 of the 6 flag raisers survived the battle: Ira Hayes, Renee Gagnon, and John Bradley. They came home to a hero's welcome, toured the country selling war bonds, and tried to live normal lives after experiencing something that was anything but normal. Hayes struggled with alcohol and died young. Gagnon worked as a janitor and died in poverty. Bradley became a funeral director and rarely talked about the war. The surviving Marines carried Iwo Jima with them for the rest of their lives. You could see it in their eyes sometimes, that distant look that meant they were back on that volcanic island, hearing the whistle of incoming artillery, smelling the sulfur and the cordite, and the death. But they also carried something else, the knowledge that they'd done their duty when it mattered most, that they'd stood with their fellow Marines when everything was on the line, that they'd helped win the most important war in human history. Iwo Jima was costly beyond imagination, but it served its purpose. The island became a crucial base for the final assault on Japan, a place where damaged bombers could land safely after their missions over the Japanese mainland. More than 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima during the final months of the war, carrying more than 27,000 airmen who might otherwise have been lost. Some historians argue that those numbers justify the price we paid for Iwo Jima, 6,821 American dead to save 27,000 American airmen. But that's not how we thought about it at the time. We fought for Iwo Jima because it was there, because it was in our way, because taking it brought us one step closer to ending the war and going home. The real lesson of Iwo Jima isn't about the strategic value of volcanic islands or the mathematics of casualties versus objectives. It's about what ordinary men can accomplish when they're fighting for something bigger than themselves, when they're willing to sacrifice everything for their buddies, their unit, their country. Standing on the beach at Iwo Jima today, you can still see the black volcanic sand where we landed on February 19, 1945. Mount Suribachi still dominates the southern tip of the island, though now it's topped with radio antennas instead of artillery pieces. The island is peaceful now, home to a few hundred Japanese civilians and a small military base. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of the battle, rusted equipment, abandoned bunkers, memorial markers where particular units fought and died. The island remembers, even if most of the world has forgotten. For those of us who survived Iwo Jima, the island will always be with us. Not just the horror of it, though that's certainly there, but also the pride of having been part of something important, something that mattered. We were Marines, and we did our job, and that's something that can never be taken away from us. The flag that was raised on Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, still flies in the photograph that made that moment immortal. But the real flag of Iwo Jima flies in the hearts of the men who fought there, who died there, who came home carrying the memory of that terrible, heroic battle. We were ordinary men who did extraordinary things because that's what the situation demanded. We weren't heroes, we were just Marines doing our job. But sometimes, doing your job in the right place at the right time is heroic enough. That's the legacy of Iwo Jima, not the strategic importance of the island or the symbolic power of the flag raising, but the simple truth that when everything is on the line, Americans will stand and fight and die for each other and for the principles that make their country worth defending. 36 days of hell to capture 8 square miles of volcanic rock. It was the most costly battle in Marine Corps history, but it was also one of the most important. And for those of us who were there, it was simply what we had to do. Semper Fi. Corporal James Bradley survived the Battle of Iwo Jima and returned home to Wisconsin, where he worked as a funeral director for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about his experiences in the war, but his son James Bradley Jr. would later write the best-selling book, Flags of Our Fathers, which told the story of the 6 men who raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. John Bradley died in 1994, taking most of his memories of Iwo Jima with him to the grave. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted from February 19 to March 26, 1945. American casualties totaled 26,038, 6,821 killed, 19,217 wounded. Japanese casualties were estimated at 18,844 killed and 216 captured. The battle demonstrated both the cost of invading the Japanese home islands and the determination of American forces to pay that cost. 3 months later, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended World War II without the need for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan.